ordinances now, there's only seen two of them. I see one that's addressing only repeal up to the 192 ordinance, one that repeals everything all in whole. And what's the difference?
No, I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about, there are three ordinances that are up for consideration for repeal. There is two drafts
Yes.
of before the committee of ways to do that, ways to do that.
I would like there to be a third draft, which is just simple repeal. That's my position, I guess.
Okay, so I'll comment on anything less than the repeal is going to still leave the borough open to litigation and potential costs, right? If you, a strict reading of the existing gun ordinances in the state of Pennsylvania say that if any municipality that passes an ordinance that's more restrictive is in violation. So we are in violation today, and we are still liable then for additional court fees and the like. Whether 192 passes or not, we could still be sued and have to defend that position. So I recommend we continue sticking with state law.
Thank you.
Dangerous when they live in the borough. Just a question, does an individual store owner have the right to refuse entrance to somebody that's carrying?
Absolutely.
Because the guy goes into a bar with a gun, what can possibly go on?
Absolutely.
Well, he has the right to refuse, you know.
Perhaps it's a good point for the solicitor to explain the two ordinances that Joe's made
Yeah, okay.
some reference to them, but there are two options that have been prepared for your consideration.
Right. Yeah. Both ordinances contain a host of whereas clauses. I won't go through those. Those mostly, I think you effectively heard what the substance of those whereas clauses are in one form or another. And whereas clauses really have very little, if any, legal effect. So the focus is on the, now therefore be it hereby ordained and enacted section. So that's what I'll focus on. And there, each of the two drafts have three separate repeal sections. And for each, they relate to those three ordinances that we've talked about. The one that addresses the use or discharge of firearms in the borough generally, the other that addresses addresses parks, and the third that addresses parking lots. So those are the same with regard to each. And then they simply go about the repeal in different ways, one very straightforward, one not as straightforward. So the straightforward version looks at each of those sections, and so for Chapter 6, Part 2, Section 201, which is the discharge of firearms section, it simply says that section is hereby repealed. With regard to Chapter 6, Part 3, Section 304, which deals with public parking lots, it would strike the word firearm from paragraph 9, the section that contains that limitation on what you do in a parking lot related to firearms. So it would take the firearms portion out of that ordinance. So just straight out strike the word firearm. Strike one word. And it preserves the rest of it, which doesn't relate to firearms. The final ordinance that has a repeal section, has a section repealed, is Chapter 16, Part 2, Section 206. That's the parking lot section, and again, it's simply striking the words that relates to the limitations on firearms. So it doesn't do anything to the rest of it related to air rifles, which are specifically excluded under state law from the definition of firearms. It doesn't relate to those things that aren't firearms. So it would simply say strike the phrase firearms of any description or, so that you could read that section without any reference to firearms. There's a heading in that section. Headings don't have legal effect, and it isn't addressed in this ordinance, but we would have an editor's note that the heading should be changed, because the heading currently says hunting and firearms. We'd be taking out the relation to firearms, so that heading would change. So that's ordinance 1, just striking that one section as a whole and striking the firearms words from the other two. I'll call that, because that's the simpler one, I'll call that version 1. Version 2 gets to the same point at the end of each section, but it has some extra language to address other issues first. So I guess I'll just read what these look like. So this would add 2 sentences to the end of section, of each of the sections, okay? And the 2 sentences would be, nothing contained in this part shall be interpreted or applied to constitute the regulation of, and then it quotes from the Uniform Firearms Act, the lawful ownership, possession, transfer, or transportation of firearms, ammunition, or ammunition components, when carried or transported for purposes not prohibited by the laws of this Commonwealth. So nothing contained in this part shall be interpreted or applied to constitute regulation of that kind in a manner that would be inconsistent with the Uniform Firearms Act. So that anybody reading the ordinance going forward would know that that's not what, that we're not regulating that lawful ownership, possession, or transfer. And then the second sentence to be added is that to the extent that Act 192 of 2014 is deemed to be constitutional and not declared invalid, and to the extent that this section cannot be applied in a manner consistent with the Uniform Firearms Act, it is repealed. And so the other 2 sections of version 2 do the same kind of thing, but with regard to the other ordinances. So same 2 languages, same 2 sentences added, and then as it relates to that section about the regulation of the parks, it says, to the extent that Act 192 of 2014 is deemed to be constitutional and not declared invalid, and to the extent that the paragraph cannot be applied in a manner consistent with the Uniform Firearms Act, the word firearm is stricken from this paragraph. And then the third one, the same setup, to the extent that it's constitutional and can't be applied in a manner consistent with the Uniform Firearms Act, the phrase firearms of any description or is stricken. So this version 2 provides interpretive sentences into the ordinance that provides direction to residents and direction to the police about what's being regulated and what's not. And to the extent that it can't be applied or interpreted consistent with the Uniform Firearms Act, it then carries out the repeal. So you've got a simple version and a more complicated.
Keep it simple.
The more complicated version, does that explain fully intent that there is no, whatever the words are? Does that protect us more? That's a basic question.
I think the cleanest approach is the simpler version. That there's less room for debate in version 1 than there is in version 2.
And this is version 1.
Version 1 is the
Version
outright.
version 1 is the one that has a date, yes.
It's called draft option 2.
Yes. Yep.
Mr. Burke?
Yes, Donald Burke, Borough resident and councilperson 3. It sounded to me, Jordan, like the second one that you read refers a lot to the state law and its constitutionality. So since it's being now challenged in court, would ours continue to be fluid based on whether or not it's held to be constitutional or not?
Well, it's a somewhat of a complicated answer, unfortunately, because as has been noted earlier, what Act 192 does is broadens who has standing to challenge a borough ordinance and provides for that fee shifting. but existing law under the Uniform Firearms Act already provides a mechanism for a challenge. So to the extent so 192 doesn't increase doesn't change the law on whether you violate it doesn't make it more or less likely that our ordinances violate the Uniform Firearms Act. It makes it easier to sue us and easier to have the borough hit with fees if you do bring those claims.
It increases our vulnerability.
So, yeah, it increases the impact of that vulnerability.
Yes, sir.
John Calabrese, I don't live in the borough, but I live in the township. I think the easiest version is to follow the law. The law is pretty standard right now.
Amen.
The state has put the law in front of you. You know what it is. Follow the law. As far as having fines, if you're following what the state and the Constitution now says, you don't have to worry about it. Just follow what the law is. This gentleman's going to give me a ticket if I don't want to put a quarter in the meter. I have to follow the law. There's nothing that anybody is asking that carries a gun, that is saying that we want you to do anything outside what the state wants you to do. This should be a clear, easy, open and shut matter. I don't even know why we're sitting here tonight. This is the law.
Exactly.
You know, we're not questioning, we're not saying do something different, just follow the darn law. This should not be something that we should be spending this much time on. There's going to be people that don't want guns in the town. Your neighbors that are walking by you have guns on. Your friends have guns on. It's not going to change anything. Everything's going to happen. I guarantee you there's a lady in the park with your children who's got a gun in her pocketbook that's licensed and trained. That's not going to change. That is the law today. And why this is happening, why we're sitting here, and the only person that possibly has any good chance in making something good of this is this gentleman sitting over here. I mean, he basically said he's challenged the courts before and possibly make good, and God bless him for that. But that is the only person in this room that has any standing for what we're doing here this evening. I don't know, it seems like a nice gentleman, but you know, I don't think so.
There are other people who will disagree.
I'm sure that I was giving you the benefit of the doubt. I know, I sound like a nice guy. But really, I mean, if anybody can answer me why we are talking about this when the Constitution has been signed, state representatives have already signed this is the word of the state. If I was coming here tonight and said I don't like one of the laws in Doylestown, you guys would be all over me. Now, we're saying the same thing. This gentleman basically said, you know, that's saying that right there, and I hear it coming up slowly, that you're moving over to what is supposed to be done. What's the problem?
We have repeal ordinances in front of...
Right. That's the process we have to go. This is the process we have to go.
Make the simplest one, vote on it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I would like to do.
Smart man. Mr. Mayor.
Well, I think it's unsettled law, at least until the court case is heard. It's not law at all until January 5th, but I believe that there is a feeling that the court case has merit, and so my question to our solicitor is that under the second version, if indeed the court case were to be successful, then those provisions that currently are in the ordinance will continue.
No.
Could you explain that?
Yeah, because again, actually, 192 is not the Uniform Firearms Act. So if the borough were, please, if the borough were challenged, if the borough's ordinances were challenged, they'd be challenged for violating the Uniform Firearms Act. They wouldn't be challenged for violating Act 192. Act 192 makes it easier for people who aren't from the borough to challenge the ordinances, and it provides a financial incentive for a lawyer from elsewhere to do it because of the fee shift. But it doesn't change the scope of what's lawful or unlawful under the Uniform Firearms Act. So if the